leading the discussion on the history of Pecan Island and its wetland system down in Vermilion Parish. And he grew up there, I guess was born there, went to school there, still has a home there, and has watched the change over time of the marshland surrounding, because he was in it, trapping, fishing, uh, I guess moving cattle around, observing the changes. The Pecan Island Road was started, I guess, in 1953. Took about 4 or 5 years to finish. When Hurricane Audrey came, June 27th, I think today is that date, the road had just been open for a couple of months. It was a shell road, and it did have power lines along with the road. They brought electric power, I guess, for the first time.
Correct. I was in
Yeah.
elementary school. We got the road, and a few years later, they actually
Yeah.
turned the power on to us.
Right. So we are real fortunate. Sonny, thank you for being here. And we'd like to first start with your history of it. What's your recollections of growing up on Pecan Island? How many people were there? How many people in the school? And what the land was, the lay of the land at the time, and what was it like?
Well, thank you so much for having me. In my earliest years, one of my earliest memories in childhood was actually riding on the old mail boat to go to town. I don't remember much of the trip. I remember.
It starts at, they docked at Shell Morgan.
Correct, that was the first
And,
stop, then we'd continue on up to
Ivy
Abbeville.
Richard ran that boat for a bunch of years, I mean, many years.
Correct. The boat would leave on a Monday morning, and it'd stop in Intracoastal City, like you said, and then go on up to Abbeville. The wealthier people would leave their car in Intracoastal to hurry up and go to town, have more time for shopping. Most of the people would actually ride the boat up to the city wharf in Abbeville.
Wow.
And the doctors would, stores, feed stores and such, would stay open a little late. They knew the Monday, Wednesday, and Friday the mail boat would be coming to town. So we'd shop, the adults would shop or whatever business they had to do. A few attorneys would stay open in legal work and get a room either in a boarding house or in the larger hotel. And then the next morning you'd get on the mail boat and go back to Pecan Island.
And this had to be about a 30-mile trip at least.
I would say about a 30-mile trip. It was a pretty full day because the boat would leave usually at first light.
That's 7, 8 miles an hour.
Yeah, right. It was an old slow boat.
Big old boat that could carry vehicles, I guess.
Correct. And I mean, you could actually some of the pictures I saw was it'd be a car on the front deck of the boat.
Yeah.
Crossways. That's how they would older cars would get down there. And then.
Yeah, and once the car was on the island, it could only leave by boat.
Right. It was pretty much there.
Right. Yeah.
And the roads, like we discussed, some of that we'd call it the coops on the front ridge, where the water actually flowed through from the north to the south. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Looks like about 8 or 9 little bayous, if you will, that would pass through the front ridge to drain from the north to the south.
And there were sandy bottoms, so on a horse or pulling a wagon, they were shallow.
Correct.
You could get through it.
Correct. All the times that I recall having trouble when, like, if 2 wagons or 2 vehicles tried to cross at the same time and got a little bit off the main path, which wasn't often. Usually, whoever was there first, the other would wait. But and I guess
And they raised cotton at one time?
correct. Actually,
Yeah.
when I was about maybe right before I was in the first grade or maybe the first grade, there was
So about what year is your first grade?
55.
55.
55. So and cotton had pretty much been phased out, but it was difficult when you would get to spring rains and floods, wipe out your crop unless you was fortunate enough to have your crop was on the actual ridge itself. It was off to the edge, you'd lose your crop. But actually, about my first grade, there was an older gentleman that had farmed cotton for years, Purvis Vincent. He had about a 30, 40 acre field that was levied and pumped. and Leonard Bort. You know, he's neither one of these gentlemen ain't with us anymore. But anyway, he had just got married, and
They were old when you went to first grade.
right. But Leonard was probably in his I guess early 20s. He had just married Miss Margaret Connor, and he tried cotton farming, and he had a pretty good crop, and he would pass in an old pickup and pick up a few of us to go pick. And I went with my grandpa a time or two, and he'd pick, and I'd tote a sack, and I'd pick a little bit. At the end of the day, I mean, if I weighed my little sack, and my grandpa gave me, I don't know, 50, 75 cents. He told me that was my share, but in reality, I mean, I think I was pretty well paid for the time, what everybody else was making,
Well, they paid
you know.
25 cents a sack, I believe.
Yeah,
it took almost an hour to pick a sack.
right. It was a lot of work for not much money.
Yeah.
But and I guess that the next thing, going through the years, the next thing I remember was actually the road itself. And when it finally did open, I mean, it was a levee through the marsh. People that go down there now, you see a canal on each side, and they dug up a lot of sediment out.
See, they dug the canals, and that's what took so, they had to let it settle like 18 months, and they did that 3 times.
Right. It was a lot of work that went into it, and actually I had an old uncle
That
that
was one of the first marsh roads in Louisiana.
really.
Yeah. And they really, there was big arguments that the whole thing should have been a bridge.
Really.
Oh, yeah. And they decided, it was, even the bridge would have been a little more expensive than building a levee road.
Yeah.
But it was less.
Yeah, it was,
But it was, the Colorado Road cost almost $1 million a mile across the marsh.
and that was in the 50s, or what it'd be
In the
today,
50s.
15,
Well,
18
that's-
million.
At the time, that's what you build a 4-lane highway.
Yeah.
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 But anyway, but finally the levee was complete, and they put the old ferry in there at Little Prairie.
Yeah.
And I had an old uncle that lived down on the east end of the island on what's the Front Ridge, and right near where the road would go down in T there near the Exxon and Columbia.
Yeah.
And he had an old Army surplus. This is the early 50s, right after World War II. He had an old Jeep, a little Willys Jeep. And every afternoon, because they had a couple of these old coops along that road that, just no bottom. It was old bayous, uncharted, unmarked bayous, but it was actually waterways. And there were soft spots. And every afternoon he'd take off, and I'd spent months with him when I was, a young kid before school. And he'd go up to Little Prairie. And there would typically be 1 or 2 cars in each one of those mud holes, and he'd charge them, I don't know, 50 cents or what, I don't know.
Pull them out.
To pull them out. But it had 3 spots going north. And he'd stop at the first one, it'd be 1 or 2, and he'd pull them out and go to the next one, it'd be another 1 or 2, pull them out, and then he'd get to the third one just before Little Prairie Ferry and pull them out. And typically, he'd sit there and wait a few minutes, then he'd start following them back to make sure, there was nobody stuck on the road after dark. But if you didn't hit the next mud hole at a good enough speed to get through it, he'd get his other 4 bits again. He'd get a double. But anyway, and then he'd follow everybody back to the island. His name was Gilbert Vaughn.
Wow.
And I remember, taking, I don't know how many I actually took.
This was actually on what is now the Colorado Road, or this was? on the
Highway
Ridge?
82.
Highway
Highway 82 between Little Prairie and
So,
Pecan Island.
people, we used it as they were building it.
It was after they built it because the ferry was already there.
Okay.
But I mean, this was, early, mid-early 50s, but it was
Yeah.
before,
They actually officially opened it May of '57.
oh yeah, this was before that,
About 2 months
when Audrey
when
hit.
Audrey hit, yeah.
Yeah.
Officially opened.
Yeah, because when it was first opened, I mean, it was, that back then, they'd still use clamshell.
No, they used the shell
They used that,
from the Alligator Mound.
yeah. And it was a
They-
shell
they
road.
paid- They paid the owner like 5 cents a yard
Yeah.
for the shell. And you had all kinds of artifacts on the road.
Yeah.
and kids go pick up, the pottery and arrowheads and all that kind of stuff. And they did that on that road and the road between Forked Island and Perry, and between Intercoastal and Perry. They used the mound on the north end of what they call the square mound. They took that down to build those roads. And it's kind of interesting that one of the mound on the north end, this is north of Pecan Island, there's a square mound. And it was almost like 210 feet on a side. And it was square with the diagonals north, south, and east, west.
Really?
And it's like 25 feet above sea level. And then about 500 yards north of that was a very high round mound. And the round mound was like 150 feet across the top. That was a burial mound. And then from the round mound, there was a road to the woods. On the, there was there's a school section there, section 16. That Oak Ridge, that's between the Intercoastal and White Lake. And it was the only instance of a road building project in Louisiana archaeology.
With that,
And there was in 1931, one of the guys dredging up the burial mound brought a skull to the Abbeville Meridian. And the editor finally convinced Shell Morgan to take him,
to look
to
at.
look at.
No, but
And they got there, and it was like 3 or 4 months later. But these are big mounds, and they're dredging with a bucket dredge. And the article said there were hundreds of bodies on the boards with the shells. And the bodies of the savages would work as well to smooth out the road for modern automobiles.
wow, kind of rough.
And now, along that road and the Pecan Island Road, kids along there would collect artifacts, and Mr. Gooch in Abbeville would give them 25 cents a bucket
For
for the
artifacts.
artifacts.
I,
5-gallon bucket.
that's part of the
And
history
when
that,
he passed away, he had them in a garage. And it was a truckload, there's many, they're guessing there's over 100 of these buckets of artifacts. And somebody went and emptied the garage, and then it was reported as a theft, and whoever took it, finally, according to the museum in Abbeville, went to the bridge and dumped them off the bridge.
yeah, that's a lost history.
Yeah.
But like I said, that's some of my earliest memories. And I guess, kind of during that time, immediately
Now, you were, as growing up, you trapping?
after I got up older,
You weren't trapping when you were 6, but
no,
when you were 12 or
probably
13.
10, 12, 13, I started trapping, around the house, back of the house, and in the front where you had came with us when
Yeah.
run crab cages out there. Used to, it'd
Lord.
dry out in the summertime, and I guess not long after they opened the road, Slimco brought power down there, and
Yeah, yep, right.
I
Yep.
remember getting the electric. Before that, we had like about a window fan that was run on a little small air cool motor. For at night, it would run that.
Really?
Yeah, it was like a little hand crank. I mean, it wasn't electric start or anything. You remember those old washing machines had
Yes.
little air cool motors.
They had a
and,
2-cycle motor.
and that's how.
A friend of mine in Catahoula rebuilt one of the little motors.
That
They
was
got it running.
that
And
was-
they ran washing machines with it.
that was a washing machine. The same. I'm sure the same design, manufacturer.
The
Little air
washing
cool.
machines that would run with that air cool motor, and washing machine and so forth, they run fans with it.
Right.
Yeah. And refrigerator.
We had our refrigerator I don't know if it wasn't a Kenmore Frigidaire, one of those. It ran on butane,
Oh, yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
It had like as a kid, I couldn't comprehend it because it had a pilot light.
Yeah.
But, and that old thing, Frigidaire, I'm not sure what it was. But I mean, from when I was, no telling how old it was when I first remembered it as a kid, but we still had it when I got out of high school. It was, you know, back then things didn't break.
Well, there was no moving parts. It didn't have a compressor.
Right.
And you know, air conditioning is what they call heat of vaporization. You take a liquid and change it to a gas. And that absorbs heat. That's what air conditioning and refrigerating. And you can do it with a light heating the liquid. It's like boiling water. That is
Yeah.
a light about the size of a cigarette lighter. And that's what they use in the Yukon and Alaska and all. They all have butane refrigerators. And like a 20 cubic foot combination freezer refrigerator take 1 5-gallon tank a month.
And, you know, and the next thing I suppose remembering up was, well, we ran crab cages with me that day, you know, in 3 foot of water. Was that as a kid, you know, a lot of people had a few cows, some more than others, but every time somebody worked cows, several people would go help and you'd turn back and forth. And Irvis Broussard, he's no longer alive now, but him and his dad had cattle on the Front Ridge, and we'd discussed that Louisiana Fur Canal that ran east and west from the Exxon Canal back to Rollover Bayou, probably 1.5 miles or so south of the ridge. And an old cow got away and took off. And summertime, about this time of the year, June, and he said, "Come on." I was still sitting on my horse, a kid, and we took off chasing that old cow. And I mean, it was dry. The marsh was dry, dusty. And we finally, you know, we had no water. Finally, we got around her.
This is on the south side.
On the south side of Pecan Island, what's all lakes now.
Yeah.
We finally got around the old cow and brought her back. And he was talking about, you talk about dry. He said we rode all, you know, almost all the way to, we called it Louisiana Fur Canal, but it was a good 1.5 miles or so out. We probably didn't ride 1.5 miles.
They call it the Humboldt Canal.
No, this is a Strapper's Canal. It's a different canal.
Canal.
Correct.
It was much smaller.
Yeah, it was probably, you know, when it was dug, it was probably 25, 35 foot wide. You know, you couldn't pass
3 or 4
barge.
feet deep. You weren't gonna run a crew boat down
Borderline.
Yeah.
You know, it was, you know, probably 4 foot deep,
it. In a high tide, you could run a crew boat.
pretty much.
Yeah.
And then, you know, kind of moving up, you know, there was a lot of marsh grass, and every year it would dry out. Both the north and the south marsh would dry out. It would dry out. Vegetation would take off. You know, all your wild rice and everything, seed plants.
Yeah.
And you know, we had an abundance of ducks. We had you know, in White Lake, we had abundance of
Canada geese.
Oh yeah, they had geese and ducks. I haven't saw a goose on Pecan Island probably in 40 years, more or less.
Really?
And when I was really, I mean, just everything has changed.
There used to
There's
be geese in that country.
when I was about in the
They would eat the same stuff the muskrat eat.
yeah.
Every corner grass.
That's been we talked a little bit about
Yeah.
that. I think it's been 24 years since I've seen a muskrat bed out there.
I haven't seen a muskrat mound in Vermilion probably in 30 years, and I'm hunting all the time. I'm
Yeah.
out there, you know, and what a dramatic change, because like for trapping, muskrat was the bread and butter.
Yeah.
I mean, you
Yeah.
get $1.50 and you could catch 100, 150, 200.
I mean, you could just look out and see nothing but mounds all
Muskrat
across
mounds,
that marsh.
And they use a little bitty trap, and, you know,
Yeah.
little Victor trap, and it's pretty easy to catch them around the mound, because all that trail.
Right.
came in.
Right. And you just
'Cause you could set 10 traps around a mound.
and you'd catch that mound out and go to the next one. You know, you didn't
Yeah.
take an abundance of traps to do pretty good. And I guess in the spring of the year, you know, and like I said, late in the year, late summer until late fall, early winter, it would start raining. You know, I mean, just
Yeah.
seasonal. And we would start getting water, you know, coming through the bayous and stuff, getting into White Lake. And with all those cuts and old bayous around Pecan Island, the marsh would flood
Right.
to the south. We didn't have the freshwater bayou channel. We didn't have the oil field canals and stuff. So
Sure.
it was sort of like a little, not a fishbowl, but it was pretty
seafood.
isolated from the deep water.
The-
It,
Yeah,
it was a lot of fresh water coming in, and with the small openings it had, the salt water didn't really have a big chance to intrude because the fresh water would keep those small openings.
Always coming through White Lake.
Correct, correct.
Yeah.
And but anyway, in the spring, south of the island would flood, and man, it would be full of garfish. I mean, you'd go out there with a a pirogue and a old call a garden rake, a long big rake, and they'd be spawning, and you'd just go and gaff them, put them in the pirogue, get you 2, 3, 4 big garfish, and come out, skin them, and you'd dry them, like make tasso. You'd
Yeah.
salt them, put them in a little smoke shed, and then it'd last for months, But I mean, it was a I guess high protein food source. But what was an annual occasion, the flooding, is now it's just the water level. It's just always
It's
flooded.
always at the same level because
It's sea level basically.
when they built the Pecan Island Road, it really sealed it off. Before the Pecan Island Road, White Lake through the marsh was connected towards Belle by to the east.
Correct.
And so the lake could drain over the marsh. And it was draining through the soil and over it. So this is what is it, 10 or 12 miles
From White Lake to the Gulf about, right.
Yeah, and so it always drained, so that was one of the arguments at the time, I remember, that it would make White Lake an impoundment.
And it did.
And it
there,
did.
there was some supporting that.
Oh,
I
yeah,
mean,
very definitely.
that
all the rice farmers in Maine Parish,
that's
which was all north of it, they were drawing water from White Lake. And so they were all for that, to make it a freshwater impoundment. And then when they set up the law, the federal law that financed all the locks and everything, and I have copies of all that, they set the water level as +3. And one of the first things it did, you see, we had a flock of about, the estimate is around 1,000 whooping cranes on the North Shore of White Lake. And they didn't migrate.
then. Okay.
No, they were
right.
not migratory.
Okay.
They were local. And they, when they flooded that marsh, when they kept it it didn't go up and down with the tide anymore.
It was just holding a
Just
pond.
holding a pond, and of course, that really changed all the vegetation in the marsh, but it also flooded their nesting grounds. And it knocked out the juvenile crab. Juvenile blue crab was their food.
Yeah.
And they couldn't come in, so they both starved out and they couldn't reproduce.
Yeah.
And so that's why, and this guy Lynch recognized that was going on. And look, people from going out and ate those things. And I remember him talking about.
What's this for? Who are you talking about?
Talking about Lynch. He's a Dr. Lynch was an ornithologist.
Right. Okay. Sims Lynch's dad.
Sims Lynch's dad.
Okay. Okay.
And he had married
Segura, right.
Segura from Seniority.
Correct.
See, he was flying a plane for Audubon. I always thought he was flying a plane for the Coast Guard. He wasn't. He flew a plane for Audubon, in like right after the war, and for whatever reason, Audubon would land. They would land there at Seniority, and that's how. And the Seguros were living there then. And
Right.
that's how he
Right.
met. They
Right.
still own property there.
Right.
And so that's how all that came together. But he got, I think he captured like 10 of them and brought them to Port Aransas to save them.
I'll be. That's impressive. I know a little bit about him, not much. Just I know he was
But he got credit
like
for
an
saving.
environmentalist and
Oh,
had
yeah.
a lot
Oh,
of
yeah.
conservative
Oh, yeah.
and
Yeah.
conservation. I mean,
Yeah, well, he worked for Audubon, and but he got a lot of credit for saving the whooping crane. And I remember him talking. He was our neighbor. We lived about maybe a quarter mile on the on Carmel Avenue, Progress Highway. And I remember talking to him, and he talked about he was interviewing two trappers about how the whooping grain disappeared. One of them said, "Well, they weren't bad eating. They got a real
Big
big
breasts.
gizzard,
Oh,
a big
gizzard.
gizzard, a real
Yeah.
big gizzard."
You know,
This is a
you
big bird.
talking about that hole in that water, there was an old gentleman, you know, he was, and actually much older than myself, probably more my dad's age, Stephen Broussard. And they were friends, you know, we were all young at one time. But he was friends with somebody in the Cow Island, I guess, area, big into farming, property owner. And they were both kind of newlyweds. They would visit each other occasionally and stuff. And he was telling him about these locks and dams and what they're going to hold water and what. And so Stephen Broussard, and he told me this, Stephen did, sitting at his kitchen table one day. He said, I told him, well, you know, I realized what that person was saying. He said, well, you can't do that. And so the guy said, well, what do you mean? He said, there's no South Bank. And the guy says, yeah, there is, Pecan Island. I said, that's so. He told me, I said, it was there for the weekend. I told that son of a gun to pack his stuff, get out of my house, and carry his ideas back to his house north of White Lake. He said they'd been flooding us out now, and when we was having that conversation, it's been decades. Still now, you know, it's I think now they try to hold 2 foot above sea level in White Lake. They're about. I mean, they shoot for it. You know, in dry years they can't hold it because
they can't let
those
the
old
water
levees
in.
it seeps so much.
Yeah, they can't let the water in. And then, you know, they're not pumping it for rice anymore.
No, it's
You know, because most of them drill their own wells. There was a private company that owned White Lake.
yeah, it didn't. There's a
It's
bank.
privately owned now.
Really?
Absolutely.
Well, I know there's a bank that had.
Well, it's Whitney Bank.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Whitney Bank originally owned it, and that they farmed it out to a group of their and formed a company. It's Vermilion Acadia Irrigation, and they would sell the water to the rice farmers of Vermilion Parish from White Lake.
I wasn't aware of that.
Oh yes, and they finally realized. I mean, they got 20% of the crop, and they finally somewhere along the line woke up and realized they could drill a well cheaper than buying the water from White
You know,
Lake Irrigation.
I mean, am I kind of
And
close
look,
to right?
I remember this because the manager of it had an office in Crowley, and he got a new Cadillac every year, and it was always black. And each year he would give his old car, which is a year old, to his sister in New Orleans. And every year we'd bring him to the books so he could pick the colors, you know.
Yeah.
It was always black.
You know, I mean, I'm not
And
sure,
he
but
ran that irrigation, and now what's the big change is the rice of the parish is being converted to sugarcane.
right.
And,
Well, somewhere's in there. Is that legal to own a lake?
no,
Well, I know it's kind of off topic, but I
No.
mean, the subject came up.
but you see, during Reconstruction, you bring up a real important point. You see, it's not legal to own a marsh.
Title.
Any land subject to tidal overflow at the highest tide of the year of a depth sufficient to float a hypothetical toothpick belongs to the state.
Oh,
So it's illegal to sell the marsh, it was illegal to sell the swamps, like all the Chaffelin Basin, that's all tidal.
yeah.
It's tidal all the way to Simsport. They got, in low water, you got a 14-inch tidal imprint at the Simsport lock.
Oh,
So all that swamp covered with tidal water.
Yeah,
I mean,
boy.
and they passed a law in 1880. It's Act 75, paragraph 11, which set up the state land office whose duty it was to sell the public lands of Louisiana, including the marsh. And marsh was defined as waters, land subject to tidal overflow, not capable of supporting agriculture or human habitation. So you couldn't farm it, and you couldn't live on it. And with that definition,
that was made legal to
There's
sell.
12.5 cents an acre.
Yeah.
And so a section costs $80. The township was 2,200, that's 36 sections. And so people from the north came and bought that. Now the high ground, which means the timberland and, not with water, but all the prairie lanes, that was 25 cents an acre. And they came and bought this, I mean, they had people came from Kentucky and they bought.
Yeah.
I mean, 10 townships was around $25,000. 10 townships.
That's
I mean, that's 360 square miles.
yeah,
And all the prairies, the reason we had, and Pecan was including it, all the prairie land was public. So you had to brand your cows.
well, okay,
and-
so like Pecan Island,
Pecan Island,
that was originally state land, because
Oh,
in
no
the
question
early years,
about it.
nobody was there, and
Nobody
that
was
that
there.
was, so
That's right.
over the years was kind of
Right.
homesteaded, or it was actually bought,
See,
you think? Or?
a lot of those sales, like the Pecan Island sales, were around 1900.
Right,
And a lot of it was like, the Louisiana Furs Group was a group of big corporate execs from,
Exxon.
Exxon, with Standard Oil at the time. It was well, no, but they were people from DuPont, from all these big corporations, and they were duck hunters. So they were buying the land for duck hunting. And then, when Reconstruction was over, they realized that they didn't have valid titles to this land. So to make the title secure, they donated a bunch of it for wildlife reserves. Rockefeller, Marsh Island,
Right, okay.
Russell State Reserve, and in most cases they didn't own Rockefeller. Rockefeller was the first big one, and they ended up with the minerals and everything.
Yeah,
The state had
yeah.
the minerals.
But then, on Pecan Island itself, from like the early years, I remember the spring flooding it all. And we got the electricity, like I said, when I was about in the first grade, about the same, a few years after the road opened.
By
And then-
1958, 59.
And then in about, starting in the early 60s, they started dredging the road out to connect Pecan Island to Grand Chenier.
Yes.
And I remember Dad came in one day and he was talking about Highway 82
And they
was
were-
going to be a main road, and
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 they were closing all the bayous as they went.
a lot of
Most
them,
of them.
a lot of them. Actually, there's some bridges between Pecan Island and Grand Chenier. I guess
Yep.
conservation was a little more upbeat, because like all the old sloughs and bayous between Little Prairie and Pecan Island, I mean, they put a few culverts in there, but that's been 70 years ago. That's collapsed. That's
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
you might have a little water trickling, but not much.
And much.
And then about in the early early 60s, I guess, I probably just got in high school, there we got telephones. I mean, you could actually pick up the phone and call someone. Now it was party lines, so you had to you'd pick up, somebody be on the phone, so you'd hang up, and then sometimes you'd be talking to somebody and you'd hear somebody else pick up. Sometimes
Listen in on it. Right.
listening on, you could hear their TV on while your TV's on a different channel, or hear kids talking or something. And then, I guess,
When did you really start to notice the marshes disappearing?
let me think about that. By the time I got into,
Wasn't there a program where the parish would provide equipment and labor to actually dredge these canals so you could pump off your property?
not sure of that.
Yeah.
Not sure of that. Where our property was like between the ridges, so we never actually.
You weren't in the actual marsh, really.
Correct.
Right, yeah.
So I'm not, but I do recall that, some of the, like same people I told you about, the cattle and that front ridge, was a lot that was levied and pumped, and then a little
See,
further west.
when they built the road, they closed the freshwater bay.
Correct.
Yeah.
They closed freshwater bayou, and then when
And they
when
closed
Exxon put the
every-
canals in there,
All those
they
little
plugged it up
bayous,
too.
you call them coop, that came across the ridge, there were sand hard bottom.
Correct.
They
That
closed
that you know we
every one
have
of those.
8, however many, that's all gone.
Yeah.
From levees and then building roads and stuff. But I mean that was natural draining that would flush that salt water back. We no longer have. But anyway, I guess when I was even in high school, it don't
Y'all
seem like
started noticing these lakes and I guess you noticed on the north side first.
no.
Lakes getting bigger on
No,
the
south side. There's not that many lakes on the north side
Yeah.
between us and White Lake. The south side, I'd always hunt. When I was in
Yeah.
high school, I'd guide for hunting clubs and stuff down there. And it was, you always had waterways around the islands, but it was, you'd have an island might be 5, 7, 12 acres, but you had like a little path of water, 20, 30 foot wide around it, and then you'd have a lake, might be a 20, 30 acre lake, but on the other side of that, you always had probably,
And y'all had, alternate marsh, y'all had pirogue trails,
correct,
little canals.
correct, like we're talking about Tronasas or something like
Yeah,
that. I mean, you could take off from Pecan Island, pull your pirogue all the way to Rollover Bayou.
Yeah, across the marsh.
Correct.
Yeah.
So you always had waterway paths, and even in high school,
And they would use, they'd have a little boat with a little lawnmower motor.
little air cool,
Little
correct.
air cool motor.
And you'd put, go run your traps and stuff.
Yeah.
But after it wasn't until I was after high school where I started realizing like the lakes were getting bigger, the islands
Bigger
were
and
getting
bigger.
smaller. And then as the people up closer to the ridge that would levee and pump, naturally, I mean, not when but it's it's a porous. It's not much ground down there, just a lot of built-up vegetation. When you levee it and pump it, stay dry for a few years, it would compact. So when you do get natural water back on it, it's lower than the water, so now it's a lake,
Yeah.
and grass will never grow there again.
Right.
So
So they could succeed, and what it did was, when it took the water didn't compress, but when you take a low density organic soil, you take the water, the weight is just gonna compress it.
correct.
And then eventually, the levees, they sinking like a rock too.
Yeah.
And then the super high tide finds a hole, and then it fills
Then
the
it-
whole
then
thing
it's-
out. There's no coming
Then
back.
it's no coming back unless you levee it and pump it again.
Yeah.
And that's something, like over the years, like for the
Now,
Rockefeller.
you mentioned, two things I think that's really important, probably, is the geese in the marsh south of the island.
About the early '70s was the last time I remember there was a lot of geese. I mean, and
Yeah.
you go out there, and I think it was one of the early when they started that like a bumper. Like during your regular waterfowl season, the limit's 5, 7 geese or whatever it was.
Yeah.
But during you had a few weeks after that, you go out there and kill 20 geese. Seriously. Two
Yeah.
people killed 20 geese. I mean, you don't want to clean more than that.
Right.
And we'd come in, but then go out there in mid-morning, and we just, I mean, it was a shoot. And
Did people do market hunting down there?
no,
No.
I mean, when I,
Some of it, yeah.
yeah,
Well, there was some people I know.
I know, like back when I was in high school, that I never was involved with it, but I heard a little bit about maybe there was some black
People would
market.
sell ducks, yeah.
Yeah.
$2 beef for mallet.
And but now a market hunter would be hard pressed to make a living.
Oh, he's
It's
Yeah.
it's no longer the amount that we've had in the past.
So the geese now, was that, when the geese disappeared, did the muskrats start disappearing too?
Let me think about that.
'Cause they were eating the same
Probably,
food.
probably,
Yeah.
probably. Yes. Because I remember we had a good bunch of muskrats. As a matter of fact, one year, this was probably in the late '60s maybe, where they even extended the season like 45 days.
For trapping?
For muskrat trapping, because there was such an abundance of them.
Yeah.
And I mean, you'd like
You
that
look
kind
at
of,
the marsh and for the eye
you could see mounds.
mounds.
And you know, in some places, I guess where the food source was better than others. I mean, you could stop and get up on the levee and look out and just see, look like just huts. I mean, just mounds everywhere.
Wow.
And that was I guess, you know, late '60s. I don't know that
Now,
it ran.
how does it stand now,
What?
muskrat?
I haven't seen a muskrat in 30 years, 40 years.
And
It's been about 30 years.
And you were out there
All the time. A lot.
fishing and
A lot.
crabbing, and you're constantly out there
A,
hunting too.
a lot.
Yeah,
A lot.
yeah,
And
yeah.
it's been,
And so what's happening to the hunt?
it's terrible. But it's no longer, you know, the ducks, in my opinion, I'm not an authority on it, but they like grain. And if your marsh dries out some, your wild rice and everything
that
germinates
grows. That's
and
right,
sprouts,
absolutely.
and we've had some good years. But you know, they're getting further apart. It's probably
Right.
been
So with
10 more or
this
less.
drought this year, I've noticed a lot more doves.
Yeah.
You're gonna see a lot more doves. I was at Intercoastal a couple of days ago, and I saw about 40 doves in one flock at
Yeah.
Intercoastal City.
That's a good sign.
Yeah, and, but White Lake is way down. And so, you got a call, let me see. You on the air? Can we help you?
Hello, I missed the first part of the program. I just wanted to know why they actually call it Pecan Island.
Okay. I'm not sure the year, but I'd say the early 1800s.
1840s.
Okay, 1840s. You know, the rural areas of of Louisiana and Texas was being encroached on a little bit, just you know, population growth. And there was an old gentleman, I can't think of his first name right now. His last name was Cole, and he was from down the Port Arthur area.
Yes, from Texas.
And his first name escapes me, but anyway, there was commerce, you know, by sailboat, you know, schooners, whatever, that would go from New Orleans to Galveston and Lake Charles. And some of the people, the sailors on the boat, from their vantage points up in the crow's nest or whatever, with you know, binoculars or a telescope, they could see some oak trees, you know, off of the beach. And that old guy from was around Port Arthur, there was a port town there, and they had told him about it, and he was an old rancher, had cattle. And they was encroaching, you know, it's free range, I guess. People were encroaching in on his range. So he was going to try and find it. So he rode his horses, him and, well, at the time it was slaves, I guess, but he had a few of them with him. And he drove from Port Arthur. He came through Cameron and Grand Chenier. You know, Grand Chenier is a ridge much like Pecan Island. You know, it's not that wide.
Yep.
And, you know, was riding through, and, you know, they'd talk, you know, he started getting further towards the east end. Where are you going? You know, like, what the heck are you doing? He said, well, I'm going to look for some land out there. Man, there ain't nothing out there but swamp. It's a no man's land. He said, well, I'm going to see. So they told him he was crazy, you know, and so he talked to a few people on his way through. He said, I'm pretty sure I'm going to find land. I got a reliable source. So, you know, and the people on the ridges on Grand Chenier and Cameron, you know, maybe they didn't have a lot of shipping commerce. They wasn't aware of it. So he came through, and it was in the late spring, or no, it must have been late summer. And, you know, the marsh had dried out pretty good, and they cut a trail, came through Grand Chenier. There's another little island between Grand Chenier and Pecan Island called Long Island.
And Mulberry.
Well, yeah, but this is further south. But he eventually made it there in decades after. But anyway, he came through, and he stayed gone for weeks. They thought he had died, got eaten by alligators or whatever. About a month and a half later, he comes riding back through, you know. He said, where you been? Well, I found that island. I ain't nothing. So anyway, so he had picked up a few saddlebags of pecans. And he'd take them pecans out and give them to him. There's pecan trees out there. And so anyway, but that's where the name came from. And then
Very interesting. Thank you.
yeah.
Okay, and then what brought, okay, they brought cattle, and then they used the slaves to clear the oak trees to plant cotton. Cotton was king. I mean, cotton was, they had discovered blue jeans, then discovered the canvas for tents and sails, all of that was cotton. And so all throughout marsh country, they raised cotton. And then one of the things, when this guy, according to the history in the Haverhill Museum, he discovered the alligator mound, and on it there was 147 completely intact human skeletons on top of the mound that were not buried. So
Right, that's we talked about, kind of northeast
yeah,
of the actual
northeast,
Pecan Island
not far
itself.
from your house.
Right,
Right.
right.
And that mound was about 1,200 feet, and to build a Pecan Island, it was large, about 20 feet above sea level. They used those shells to build the Pecan Island Road.
Yeah. But that is the history of the name as I know it.
But then citrus became very prominent from the Civil War forward to about the 1920s. And they had a big freeze come through and wiped out a bunch of the citrus and never was really planted. But that branch near Pecan Island was one of the biggest citrus producing areas in the country.
That
And Yosemite Ortiz had citrus trees and they had peaches, and they could grow watermelons and mushmelons and all that much quicker than anybody else.
Yeah, that was a big commerce.
There's a
I mean,
big watermelons. I know they raise them on Pecan Island too.
yeah.
And they barge them out with the cattle barges.
I'll be.
You know, and so I mean, these people struggled to make a living. So cattle, cotton, furs became a very, very big thing.
That was
And then eventually,
it was. I mean, before my time, I remember my grandfather, my dad, and uncles and them talking about it. I guess I'm not sure. Maybe in the 30s, early 40s. Used to it was all muskrat, occasional otter, mink, but in sometime I guess around the early 40s, an old gentleman caught the first wild nutria.
oh yeah.
Yeah, and that was from an import from South America, I think.
Yeah.
And anyway, but I mean, it brought good fur trade for years. It didn't do the marsh any good, but
And it was amazing, you know, the kids, they would go to the marsh, I guess, in November, and they would stay till the end of February. So
Yeah.
they were out of school that time.
oh yeah,
So the
That was
Trappist kid had a
yeah, it's a
slight
kind of
deficit in
spotty
education.
education.
Right, yeah, right.
But
But I mean, that was the custom,
yeah,
and
but you know we you know when I was in school, I mean that was decades ago.
and you had a lot of deer all through that marsh.
Yeah, there was there was a lot of ground
Now,
for
you have
deer.
any deer south of Pecan Island right now? Maybe on the ridge.
Very few. But I mean, you know, when I was, you know, in school, out of school, you know, in high school, I mean, you know, I'd shoot deer right back where my camp is now. You know, that was all, it would dry out most of the year, levees and ridges and stuff.
Yeah.
And just go in the back, you know, and Dad had cows and stuff back there, so there wasn't a lot of tall weeds and stuff. Go back there a lot of
Do you
mornings.
remember anybody raising peaches?
My-
You on the air? Can we help you?
Hey, Harold, it's Daryl.
Hey, good to hear from you, sir.
You and Sonny talk about the wild rice and the ducks.
Yes, sir. We've been talking about it, right? And this is spirits of the geese and the muskrat, and I guess all that marsh to the south of the island. There used to be so many frogs in there. There was one canal south of the island where we were alligator hunting. I don't know which was more valuable. You'd get $2.75 a foot for an alligator, but you'd get $1 a frog. And we could easily catch. There's one canal that had so many frogs, we called it Frog Canal. And the road to Freshwater City goes over that canal. It's a pipeline canal. And right when the marsh would get real low with drought conditions, you know, like right now we don't have, you know, much. You didn't have a very good connection to the Gulf there. But anyway, when it would get real dry, like July, August, man, those
The
ponds-
frogs that go to
frogs that go to
they
the
find
canal,
the water, yeah.
Man, they go find that water. So
Yeah.
that was
Well, Sonny, you catch still catch a few frogs though every now and then, don't you?
I tell you what, well, Jackie and I, we can go back at the camp, and we go catch 4, maybe 7 frogs, and we call it a good night.
Yeah.
A couple of decades back, this is a fact that where we hunt. Well, you've been back there with me. I went back there for either 7 or 9 nights in a row, I forget, and it was my boat, my transportation, my everything, and I'd bring a guest, but what it was somebody to skin the frogs. I'd drive the boat, they'd catch, put them in sacks, and skin them, and we'd split the frogs. And when I get 2 of these big grass sacks full, I mean, that was a night, but 2 of those grass sacks would hold over 200 frogs. Either 7 or 9 nights in a row, I went and caught, 200 frogs a night. And I mean, there was still, I'm sure we put a small dent in them, but I mean, the last night we went, we'd stay out 2.5 hours, and we'd catch 200 frogs. I mean, there was a lot of frogs back there. But we have a little bit of an alligator problem now. You might have witnessed that with us every time we go out there. They gather the eggs and they hatch them, and then they're forced by law to turn loose. I think this year they went to 17%. But I mean, you figure there's probably 500,000 eggs harvested a year in Vermilion Parish area between several alligator farmers. So that means 100 and something thousand 3-foot alligators are released into the wild, and it just and they're big enough, they 3 foot, they can kind of fend for themselves. There's so many alligators now. I actually witnessed alligators chasing smaller alligators to eat back there. It's you have.
And then part of that too is water quality. frog can live anywhere.
Yeah.
A tadpole can't. You see.
Water quality has something to do with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's part of it. Part of the negative, because White Lake, we forced them to put water quality monitors in the lake. DEQ has them in there. They didn't want to put in it because White Lake is officially not recognized as a lake by the state. It's recognized by the Corps of the state as non-navigable wetlands. There's no discharge permits from over 300 wells in there, and the Corps is part of that baloney. Even though the old intercoastal went across it, you'd think it'd be quite navigable, but it's privately owned, so that's a big factor in it, but the only time you have oxygen in the water in White Lake is when the winds exceed 15 miles an hour.
Where it whip
When
up
the
the
wind
water.
dies, when the wind dies within hours, the oxygen monitors go to 0. The exchange rate in Vermilion Bay is 200 times a year. The exchange rate in White Lake is once per 10 years. Now, historically, White Lake would exchange almost just like
The bay.
the bay. I grew up, my dad and his friend, we would fish White Lake on the North Shore. They had cypress trees. It was sand beaches. And my dad would fish with a fly rod. And if the tide was low, you were catching bass. And if the tide was high, you were catching speckled trout and redfish. And they had a little bait, they called it a Trixarino. It was a little bitty spoon, maybe about 2 inches, that it was hard to cast with a fly rod, but you could. And it would catch speckled trout and bass like crazy. It was phenomenal. And this was before the locks were built.
Schooner Bay lock?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And, that was built in 55.
On the other end is Grand Lake,
Yes.
and I think it's Catfish Lock they call
Catfish
it.
locks, right.
I'm not sure if it's
There's
different
4
parish,
locks.
different state.
There's
What?
Catfish locks, that's on the Mermentau, and then you have the locks on the Intracoastal, and the Intracoastal was finished in 1939.
Yeah, that's
And
what Leland Bowman Lock.
Well, Bowman Lock is on the Intercoastal at Intercoastal City.
So where you?
But the Calcasieu locks is
At the
right
at the west
on
end.
the west end, where the Intercoastal hits the
The
Calcasieu
Calcasieu.
River.
Okay, I wasn't sure the name of it.
Yeah. And so we right at closing time here. So Sonny, thanks a lot for being here, sharing all that history. the wetlands lost, you know, why we're losing it, and the canaries in the coal mine, you know.
Yeah, it really
The,
lost it, and it's
The
unfortunate
muskrats,
over
the
the,
geese,
over, you know,
the frogs, the whole part of it.
over the past 40 years, early on more so than the last couple of decades, I spent a lot of time going to these public meetings. And found the last time I went, I showed them, you know, and I'd hire planes and stuff to take film and everything.
Yeah.
I just kind of left it on the table and said, you know, I had enough. Like it was a waste of my time, unfortunately, because it's a valuable resource that's being lost.
It's a paradise lost.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is a
well stated.
paradise of fish and crabs and shrimp and, you know, the fur bearers. you
Yeah.
know. I mean, this was a paradise. The duck and goose hunting, Canada geese and all those, just a phenomenal
Yeah.
thing that we've lost. And, you know, we've lost it to ignorance, you know. We build a reserve and we block off all the title exchange and you dredge canals and it's not all.
You know, one of the earlier meetings I went to was trying to point a few things out. I forget Johnny, I forget his last name, but anyway, he's in charge of the Rockefeller Refuge there.
Yeah.
Sarcastic grasp got up and said, Mr. Hebert, I didn't get it. Where did you get your degree from?
Right.
Yeah, come
Yeah.
on outside,
The
buddy.
trappers couldn't read
Yeah,
and write,
yeah.
but they knew more was going on than the doctorate level.
Yeah, we witnessed it, but it's
Yeah.
unfortunate. But yes,
So thank you, Sonny, for sharing all
Oh,
your history.
it's my pleasure.
It was-
My pleasure.
Thank you so much.